Hi, this is Grandma here, and I'm reading Crispin by Avi. And today we're going to begin with chapter 57. Crispin has now changed so much since the beginning of the book. He has developed confidence in himself, and he is able to analyze situations that he wasn't able to do before. He has taken control of a situation with Aycliffe. He's faced him. He has not humbled himself. He has confronted him and has now tried to barter for Bear's release. He plans on giving Aycliffe the cross of lead in exchange for Bear. And he has a plan. And the plan is he will give them the cross of lead, which says that he is the son of Lord Furnival after they are through the gates. Okay, chapter 57. Barely believing I'd persuaded John Aycliffe to do as I wished, I held the dagger in one hand, even as I clutched the cross of lead in the other. By one or the other, I was determined to succeed. Pausing briefly to take up a candle from one of the wall sconces, the steward proceeded to go down the steps I had noticed in the corner of the great room. To my great relief, he left his sword where it lay on the floor. The steps were very wide, winding down and around to the lower floor. Upon reaching the bottom, we came into a large enclosed room with many shelves and two large tables. In the dim light, it appeared to be some kind of a pantry. There were stacks of flat bread, basers, bowls, and jars in abundance. Aycliffe continued down the hall. In this place, the walls were covered with great tapestries. Here, too, for the first time, we came upon others. Who exactly they were or what service they performed, I couldn't tell. They lay stretched out on the floor, asleep. Having never seen so large and magnificent a dwelling, it was all I could do to keep my eyes on Aycliffe as he passed through what appeared to be yet another pantry. In this place, great quantities of food were stored, so much more than I had seen at the Green Man. We saw more servants, too, but as before, they lay asleep, this time in a corner. The steward went to another corner stairway, this one made of stone. These steps plunged down steeply. Whatever warmth there had been faded quickly. The deeper we went, the colder and damper it became. Sputtering, smoky torches had been set in the wall holes every few feet. A few men were sitting on the steps, while others lay sprawled sleeping. No matter who they were, as soon as the steward appeared, they leaped up and saluted him. Only when we reached the foot of the steps did Aycliffe pause. We had come to a large, almost round area constructed of stone from the floors to the low vaulted ceilings. Coming quickly to the fore was a man whom I recognized as one of those who had attacked me the night before. There was a puzzled look upon his face when he saw me, but he nevertheless bowed to Aycliffe. "Sir," he started to say. Aycliffe interrupted. "Take me to where that red-bearded man is." The soldier took up a smoky torch and led the way. We were now moving through cellar regions, through one narrow passage after another. The ceilings were soot-blackened. The air was close and foul. Puddles of stagnant water lay afoot. The walls were streaked with green. "He's here, sir," the soldier said. We had come to a small door into the wall. "Unlock it," Aycliffe commanded. The man produced a ring of keys, selected a large one, applied it to the lock, and pulled the door open. "You may enter," he said to me. I hesitated, thinking I'd be trapped inside. Aycliffe seemed to understand my thoughts. "I've made my vow," he said as though to rebuke me. "You'll not be detained." I reached for the torch the man held. Before he released it, he looked to the steward. When Aycliffe nodded, I was allowed to take the light. Small as I was, I had to stoop to enter the room. It was small, dark, and stinking within. By the light of the torch, I saw Bear. His great bulk had been stretched upright upon a ladder-like structure, arms bound high over his head, unshod feet below just as tightly. Almost naked, his blood-stained body was striped and welted as if it had been whipped. His head hung limp upon his chest, his beard spread like rumpled napkin. "Bear," I said. He made no response. "Bear," I called again louder. When he still made no answer, I could only find the breath to say, "Bear, are you alive?" When he gave no reply, I drew closer, holding the torch near me. Only then did I see the slight rise and fall of his chest. Jamming the torch end into a crevice in the stone floor, I used my dagger to cut his bonds free, starting with his feet. By climbing the ladder, I released his hands, first one, then the other. Once free, he slid down to the floor, where he lay in a heap. On my knees by his side, I took up one of his hands. It was cut and very raw. "Bear," I said, "it's me, Crispin, Crispin," I repeated even louder. Gradually, Bear lifted his head. His face was so bruised it took a moment for him to open his eyes, or only one eye, for the other was swollen shut. At first, he merely gazed at me, uncomprehending, repeatedly blinking. "Crispin," his broken lips managed a hoarse whisper. "I'm here, Bear," I said. He continued to gaze at me, as if not sure who I was. Then he said, "Crispin, I do love you, son. Did I betray you?" "No, Bear, you didn't, and now you're to be set free." When he didn't seem to understand, I took up his raw hand and gently pulled at it. "Can you come, Bear? Can you walk? We're going to Great Wexley. We're going to leave Great Wexley." The steward swore a sacred oath to let us go. He let out a deep sigh of exhaustion. "Bear, you must come with me," I urged as much as I begged, pulling at him again. "Have they caught you too?" he said between parched lips. "I'm not caught, Bear. We're both leaving to go free, but you have to come now. You must move yourself." At last he seemed to understand. Letting forth a great sigh, he summoned enough strength to heave himself up to his hands and knees. Then he began to crawl after me toward the entryway. I left the room first. Bear followed. When he came out, he managed to only just squeeze through. By the time we emerged, a ring of soldiers had gathered and were looking on in hostile silence. Aycliffe, I saw, had found a sword. It was in his hand. I stood up, but when Bear remained on his hands and knees, I knelt before him. "Can you stand?" I said, holding out my hand. He reached out and grasped it. "He needs help," I said. "Get him some water." No one moved. "Help him," I commanded. All eyes went to Aycliffe. He gave a small nod. 3 of the men stepped forward and reached out to Bear. But when they touched him, he reared back like a wounded beast and with a spurt of energy struck away their hands. "Crispin," he called. I went before him. He looked up, seemingly to make sure it was me, then lifted one of his long arms and set it on my shoulder. By sheer strength of will, he began to pull himself up, leaning much of his weight on me. When he finally stood, I could see how cruelly battered he was. Yet he was still large enough so that some of those looking on stepped back in awe. I was handed a jug of water, which I passed on to Bear. He clutched it in both hands and drank from it deeply, then let the rest cascade over his head and body. That done, he flung it away, letting the jug smash. The water helped him, though his breath was still labored. He stood somewhat taller. He'd managed to open his other eye, if only partly. "He needs some clothing," I said. Once again, all eyes went to Aycliffe, who nodded. One of the men came forward, offering me a cloak. I placed it around Bear's shoulders. "Put a hand on my shoulder," I said to him. "We're leaving." Bear, standing behind me, did as I bid, but before me in a semicircle stood the steward and some 10 other men. All were armed. I took a step forward. No one moved. Hard hammering, I lifted my hand, the one that held the cross of lead. "Shall I read what is written here?" I said directly to Aycliffe. Bear's hand tightened slightly on my shoulder. "Shall I?" I repeated. For a moment there was no reply. Then the steward said, "You must give it to me." "You swore a vow to let us go first," I said. He said, "When you give it to me, you'll go free." I shook my head. "Once we're beyond the walls, you'll have it." "I could kill you here," he said, "both of you." "This man made a sacred vow to let us go," I said loudly. "He did so on this cross." With all looking at him, Aycliffe seemed unsure what to do. Then I said, "Shall I tell them who I am?" The steward didn't reply. In the silence, I was sure all could have heard my heart hammering. Then Aycliffe said, "I will take them to the city gates." The men stepped to either side, allowing us a narrow passage. Aycliffe took the lead. I followed. Bear, his hand still resting on my shoulder, shuffled right behind me. I turned to look at him, but could not read his emotions. Moving slowly, we made our way through the cellar regions, then to the steps. Once there, I offered myself as a crutch to Bear, which he accepted, though I sensed he was regaining some of his old strength. Even so, the climb was slow and painful. When we reached the first level, I could hear, if only dimly, the church bells ringing. I wondered if they were tolling a call to arms or to prayer. More soldiers were on guard at the front door. When they didn't move, we all stopped. "Give me the cross," Aycliffe demanded. "On your vow, not until we are safely past the city gates." "Open the doors," he said angrily. The soldiers pushed upon the doors. It was, as I had prayed, dawn. As we stepped out from the palace, the town's church bells were still ringing. Above the square, a whirl of agitated blackbirds circled through the air. Before us, traders were setting up their wares in stalls and tables. Those closest to us stopped their work and stared. Bear and I went forward. Aycliffe stayed with us, as did an escort of some 7 soldiers. "Wait," I cried, and I ran to the side of the palace and took up Bear's sack, then rejoined him. "Take us to the gates," I said to Aycliffe. Though his look was full of hatred, the steward turned and began to move along the stone-paved road. We went slowly, a troop of soldiers all around us, while I wondered if they would truly let us go. So why didn't Aycliffe kill Crispin and just take the cross? I think it's because Crispin looks so much like Lord Furnival that it would be, he can't do it himself. It's okay if he declares him a wolf's head and has somebody else kill him, but he can't do it. And then when Crispin says that he's going to announce to all the soldiers who he is, well, Aycliffe knows people will believe that, and they won't touch him. Okay, chapter 58. As we went along, passers-by stopped and gawked at us in silence. Others followed in our wake. "I have a dagger," I whispered to Bear as we approached the town gates. "Give it to me," he said, and came close against my side. When he did, I slipped the dagger from my pocket and gave it to him. He took it in his great hand, concealing it with the folds of his cloak. We reached the city gates. Though they were open, they were guarded by soldiers. Aycliffe paused and turned. In one hand he held his sword. In his other hand he had a dagger. "Let us pass," I called out to Aycliffe. In response he shouted so all could hear, "Both of you are traitors, and by honor you'll go no further. I may have made a vow to let you go, but this boy has been proclaimed a wolf's head. No one else is bound by my oath. Anyone may slay him. I'll give you £1 reward to anyone who slays this wretched boy here and now." I shrank close to Bear. It was he who cried out to Aycliffe, "Coward! Traitor!" "It's not you I want," the steward said. "It's the boy. He vexed me long enough. Leave him, and you can have your reward." In response, Bear shoved me behind him so he faced the steward. His coat had fallen away. In the morning's early light, his huge body was filthier, more bloody than I had realized. Whip and burn marks scored his chest and arms, but the dagger was in his hand. "Son of Lucifer!" he cried to Aycliffe. "Oath-breaker! Murderer!" I glanced around. The soldiers, swords in hand, had formed a semicircle behind us. Before us, it was much the same. Aycliffe stood unmoving, soldiers right behind him. Quickly they shifted so that we, the steward, Bear, and I, were completely surrounded. Some of the soldiers were grinning, so eager were they to watch us die. Beyond them, townspeople gathered too and gawked. Now the steward moved forward. His broadsword was extended and moved from side to side. The hand that held the dagger he kept wide. I tried to keep out of his way. Bear, with just the dagger held before him, remained unmoving, gazing at the enemy. Aycliffe made a thrust with his sword, which Bear stopped with the sudden movement of his dagger. The metal clashed loudly. From those around us, I heard a collective intake of breath. His stroke gone amiss, the steward backed away. Then the two men, breathing hard, eyed one another. Aycliffe made a series of lunges, first one way, then another, which Bear managed to beat off, but only because he retreated. Aycliffe paused again. It was Bear who now attacked, trying to slip sideways to the steward's dagger side while making a dive at the man's body. Now the steward swung wildly around with his broadsword, forcing Bear back. Once again, the two men paused while trying to decide their next move. It was the steward who made the next series of thrusts that Bear avoided, but I could see he was tiring. Not only was he on the defensive, he was gradually being edged back toward the soldiers who had lifted their swords up to make a wall of deadly spikes. Bear tried to move forward, but Aycliffe swung out wildly. "Bear," I shouted, "there are soldiers behind you!" Whether he heard me or not, Bear tried to press back upon the steward. While he had made some progress, it was very little. And now, as if some signal had passed between Aycliffe and the ring of soldiers, they began to creep forward, making the spiked circle smaller and smaller. It was then that Aycliffe swung hard while lunging. In doing so, he struck the dagger clear out of Bear's hand. The blade skittered across the stones. Bear made a move toward it, but it was blocked by the steward and his blades. Then Aycliffe began to close in on Bear. But with all eyes on the two of them, I ran forward and snatched up the dagger. "Bear, I have the dagger!" I shouted. Hearing me, the steward swung about. Seeing me with the dagger, he raised his sword high, prepared to bring it down on me. At that moment, Bear leaped forward. With his great arms, he hugged Aycliffe, pinning the steward's arms to his sides. The steward struggled to free himself, but Bear squeezed tighter and tighter. grunting like an animal until the steward's sword and dagger fell to the ground with a double clang. Then Bear picked up the steward, held him over his head, and flung him bodily through the air of the soldiers. It happened so quickly the soldiers had no time to react. Aycliffe was impaled on the soldiers' swords, run clear through by several points. I gasped with horror. From the onlookers, too, there were great shouts of terror. The soldiers, stunned and very frightened, moved back several steps as Aycliffe rolled back on the stone road, twitched, kicked, and became very still in his own pooling blood. No one moved. Then Bear, panting hard, snatched up the steward's dagger and sword and brandished them at the soldiers who stood before the city gates. "Make way for us," he bellowed, "or by St. Barnabas you'll meet the selfsame fate." The soldiers in the crowd slunk back. The way to the gates were clear. "Crispin, hurry!" cried Bear. I ran to where the steward lay. From around my neck, I removed the cross of lead and laid it on the steward's bloody chest. With all eyes upon us, Bear and I walked out through the gate. No one said a word. Neither Bear nor I spoke. I could hardly believe what had happened. "Crispin," said Bear, as we moved away from the walls, "in what place they had me, I heard chants coming from the cathedral. The priests were singing Media Vita in Morte Sumus, which means, in the midst of life, we are in death." "But Crispin," he said, "can you see the new truth we've made? In the midst of death, there is life." I laughed and we embraced. Then as we moved along the road, I swung Bear's sack around and pulled out his two-pointed hat, and leaping up, I plopped it on his head, albeit crookedly. But he removed the hat and placed it on my head. "I, Bear of York," he roared loud enough for all the world to hear, "do dub this boy, Crispin of Stromford, a full member of the Guild of Free Men. In so being, he is free of all obligations, save to his God." I took out the recorder. When I began to play, Bear laughed. Then he began to sing. Though he did not sing in his usual bellowing voice, it was his voice all the same. "Lady Fortune is friend and foe, of poor she makes of rich, and rich poor also. Turns misery to prosperity, and wellness unto woe. So let no man trust this lady, who turns her wheel ever so." Then as I played the pipe and Bear beat his drum, we two cantered forward on our journey. And by the ever-loving God who sits above, my heart was full of more joy than I had ever felt before. I was unfettered, alive to an earth I hardly knew, but was eager to explore. What's more, I knew that feeling to be my newfound soul, a soul that lived in freedom, and my name, I knew with all my heart, was Crispin. Thank you. That's the end.